let's get to the present times.
Mhm.
So we have, by seeing what's going on with this Ukrainian situation and the attacks, the
Mhm.
military attacks, the economic attacks, the xenophobic attacks that Russia and Russians are receiving from the West. How does the Russian people perceive themselves right now? How does Russians look at Russians? How do they see them right now? Do you think things are changing? How is your perception of that in Russia? And maybe you can also share how do you see that living in North America, in the West?
Mhm. Well, I would say that the opposite of what was intended happened. So obviously, the multi-pronged policy of having first a quasi-frozen conflict in Donbass that exploded in 2022, plus the unprecedented number of sanctions. I've lost count. I think the last time I checked, it was
Wow.
past 13,000. It might be. Anyways,
Wow.
it's more than 10,000. It's a number that really makes no sense anymore. So we have this multifaceted approach to trying to initiate a regime change in Russia. There had been other attempts to do so. Let's say in 2011, 2012, that one was a pretty serious attempt as well. So the impression was that the sanctions plus the war in Ukraine that escalated in 2022, but had been raging on since 2014, I apologize, that it would remove Putin from power and install someone more pliable, maybe not as pliable as the alcoholic Yeltsin, but definitely someone who is more pliable than Putin, which to me, as a side note, is really funny because Putin has definitely been, this Westernophile, Germanophile, right? He's a huge fan of Germany. He's fluent in German. So you probably, the next leader might be much, much, much less Western focused than Putin right now. So it's almost like there's that miscalculation of whom can we deal with coming from the official West, and sort of this grandiosity of, we're going to install exactly whom we want. But I would say so what happened was the opposite. There was this consolidation of social support around Putin. His approval rating had gone up. It fluctuated a little bit, but it's definitely improved because of that perception that Russia is, well, obviously it's kind of hard not to perceive that it's under attack when you're constantly being sanctioned, when your men are being killed in this conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that perhaps we might even witness the birth of a national idea for the 21st century Russia, which was the thing that I mentioned is absent from the constitution. But there was more self-consciousness. There's more interest in one's own culture. There's sort of this revival. I don't like to use the term nationally because Russia to me is a civilization, but let's say national revival, for the lack of a better word, civilizational revival. So it's sort of the opposite of what was hoped to happen by certain by certain members of Western officialdom. So I would say the perception is very positive as a culture and a civilization. There's a sense of dignity compared to really idealizing the West and wanting to be like the West and wanting to vacation in the West, because this is where, people go to Europe for a vacation. That tells you that you've arrived if you're able to afford, a vacation in Italy, for instance. It's been, paradoxically, it's been a positive experience in that sense. I would say sanctions for an average Russian are not really noticeable. For Russians perhaps traveling abroad and coming home, they are noticeable because there are certain restrictions as to, what credit cards they can and cannot use, buying dollars or euros. There's sort of a limit to how much you can buy these days because Russia has switched to trying to do more of the Chinese currency and, sort of trying to do other currencies in its trade. So sort of the amount of dollars in the country is just smaller. So I would say the most direct impact for the average Russian sanctions-wise is going abroad. So most people in Russia are not really feeling sanctions much, if at all, from the economic perspective.
I think it's so iconic because you see the West throw everything over the Russians, and not even the bread price is changing that much. So
it's certainly changed in North America. So that was the other counterpart where it's funny for me to be a Russian who's very connected to Russia, but at the same time who is a diaspora Russian who has lived abroad for a long time, to experience the the sanctions that are meant to target my countrymen in Russia as a Russian abroad, because I see how the prices have gone up for basic necessities. So it's been.
Yes. Can I ask you a personal question in that point?
Depends on how personal.
No. It's just a perception, a personal perception. Do you feel like me that, well, I moved my life, everything changed for me, and now they are destroying it again?
I think this is the perception that especially my father has, because obviously you sort of lost everything and you ended up starting from nothing, right? In a foreign country out of necessity. But now you see that stability. And yes, once they moved, I think there was a realization that the West is not nearly as ideal as it was presented, or as, people typically view things as, grass being greener on the other side. That's not specific to any, particular country, but that's definitely been the perception of you sort of established yourself in a new place, you're comfortable, and all of a sudden all of this seems to be collapsing again. And, what do you do? Like, for people like me, I always get the question, why don't you just go back? And even if I didn't have the particular family situation that I do, I have my family of origin. My parents are not interested in going back because they're older. They want to stay where they are, not necessarily because they're so happy with the situation in Canada, but because they're established. So it's like, the question is, do you just abandon your family and move alone? Are you this autonomous human unit who can just replant yourself in different places? It's very difficult for an immigrant to have roots in a new place. And I've moved around a few times, big cities, smaller towns, and each time you're sort of trying to have a very basic semblance of rootedness, which is very difficult for, I would say, immigrants who are like kids who are very, very young. It's easier for them that had perhaps have forgotten what life was like back in their home country. But I was of an age where I had a connection to my homeland. And so I sort of consciously, in the past few years only, so it's been a very long time, decided that, I am in North America. I need to have a sense of rootedness. I can't just be neither accepted, well, maybe not accepted, but because I'm, fluent, blah, 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 blah. I've received my education, my post-secondary education here. I need to have a sense of rootedness. And paradoxically, I found the sense of rootedness out in nature, not so much in society, which I think is like, nature is sort of a constant. It doesn't matter where you live. If you love nature, you always like to spend time out in nature. You'll always feel rooted. That was the way that how I resolved it. But for many, many years, I felt like I'm no longer Russian because I don't live there and I'm not experiencing the day-to-day. I certainly see what's happening there. I'm very plugged in. I read, local news. I watch Russian true crime. I mean, I'm really I know more about what's going on in Russia than maybe certain local news in Canada and the US, but I am also not like Russian, and Russians may not interpret me as one of them because I've been away for so long. But at the same time, I perceive myself as a Russian, therefore I do not perceive myself as a North American or like a Canadian or an American or whatever the region is. Therefore, I'm neither fitting here nor I'm fitting there. Where is my place? And so then again, you kind of either you just end up being this rootless cosmopolitan, or you kind of have to find your rootedness in some way. And this is why you have all these different types of immigrant experiences. Some really try to be, again, very hyper patriotic Russians, right? Who are disconnect from the West. Then you have the opposite, who completely reject everything Russian, and they try to sort of go out of their way to be these useful, what is the term? You weaponized immigrants and reject everything Russian, not just the politics, but the culture too. So sort of this self-hating Russian, which is like, obviously it's fine to criticize politics, but they go much, much, much further. And so I didn't want to be that, and I didn't want to be this other point. I I'm definitely patriotic, but I'm not sort of this hyper patriot where I don't want to interact with the, you know, North American communities where I've lived. And obviously I have friends from all kinds of backgrounds. And so, yeah, my way of managing this was to find rootedness in nature. I don't really know how else I can do that. I feel at home out in nature. But it is a weird, yeah, it's a weird situation to be a diaspora Russian who is, you know, if people don't know I'm Russian, they might not realize I'm, especially in Canada, that's so multicultural. People just assume that I was born in Canada. So it's, again, a sort of self-perception versus outside perception too. So yeah, it's a complicated question.
Yeah, I saw you made a short video in your channel talking about this. I remember that I wrote something, I commented something there. What you described is exactly how I see things here, being here. One day we are going to talk about this personal perception for the Brazilians that I have, but it was extremely interesting that you mentioned that. I think this diaspora feeling it's more or less common, even if you come from a long time or if you just hear that exactly what you describe in that short video. So people just go there and watch it. It's exactly what I see here. What I put myself in one of those categories, and I see other people that fit perfectly on those categories as well, on the other categories as well.